So a couple months ago, I was giving World of Warcraft Shadowlands a go, and it was my first time running this dungeon. I queued up for a BFA dungeon, and I've never done it before. And we're going through the dungeon, and we wipe, and by wipe that means all of us died. And a few seconds later, I was teleported out of the dungeon. I'm like, what happened? And it turns out that I got kicked out of the dungeon and that people voted to kick me out. And I didn't really understand why, and no one really communicated with me. And I don't know if it was even my fault to begin with. And so I have a buddy who is a mythic WoW raider. This guy is a no lifer. He's a sweaty. He plays 12 hours, 14 hours a day, or he did at the time. Now he plays Lost Ark, but at the time it was World of Warcraft. And I kind of talked to him about this. I'm like, why do you think this happened? And he said, well, this happened because you need to get good. I'm like, how do I get good? He's like, figure it out. I'm like, okay. And by then, I had already played Final Fantasy XIV. And so I asked him, why do you think that in Final Fantasy XIV that isn't the case and that people are more welcoming, more accepting, and more willing to bear with you or to help you get better at the game and lift you up instead of, just kicking you out without telling you why? And he said, well, the reason why that game is less toxic is because their terms of service dictates that you have to be. And if you're mean in that game or if you're toxic in that game, then you get a temporary or a permanent ban. And I thought about that for a while. And although he's right that game does have a term of service that, in his words, force you to be nice, I think it's a little bit deeper than that. And the first thing that came to mind for me was how Final Fantasy XIV is a narrative driven game, and how Jesse Cox said that Final Fantasy XIV is a narrative driven game first and an MMO second. And so this is a game that is very heavily reliant on the main story quest and on the narrative of the game. And then it just has some very heavy multiplayer and MMO elements in it. And when it comes to literature and when it comes to fiction, fiction and literature have been shown time and time again to help us as humans develop theory of mind and empathy. And what theory of mind is our ability to read other people and to empathize with other people and to read facial expressions better and to understand people's intentions. And the thing about fiction and narrative and literature is that it takes a whole ton of experience and it simulates a whole lot of events. And these events would maybe take a whole lifetime to experience, but it distills it down into, a 2 hour read or even a 20-hour read. And that's still a lot shorter than a whole lifetime. So through these simulations, we're gaining experience that we don't have to gain firsthand. And this helps us become wiser. This helps us become more empathetic. This helps us become better at understanding people and understanding ourselves, And so given that Final Fantasy is a narrative driven game, it seems that this is a factor in why people might be more empathetic. It kind of makes sense. And they did a brain study where they took a bunch of people and they put them under an MRI machine, which is a brain scanner, and they had them read a book. And in this novel, they were reading about somebody running through the forest. And what was interesting is while the language processing part of their brain lit up while under the MRI machine, the part of their brain responsible for running, like physically running, also was lit up while they were only just reading about running. And, it's kind of an indicator that it helps us develop this theory of mind. And they did a different study where they took 15,000 students and they noticed that over the decades, people's empathy or these students' empathy decreased by 40%. And they say that the reason this happened was because, well, people are not majoring in English as much as they used to, or history, or any of the humanities, and people are instead opting in to major in more vocational studies, such as the hard sciences, or law, or something like that, or medicine. And it kind of makes sense given that college tuition is becoming more and more expensive. And there is that joke that says, what's the difference between a park bench and an English major? And it's that a park bench can support a family of four. And so it makes sense why people would want to do this and why this is the case. However, it does come at that expense. And, the first question that came to my mind was, well, how are you measuring empathy? And I have a friend who's in his mid 40s now, and this guy's an academic. This guy has a couple degrees. He has one in engineering. He has one in Asian literature. And he's a mathematician for a Fortune 500 company. So this guy really likes to read. This guy really likes to study. And We were talking about this a few years ago, and he said that his opinion is that the social sciences are kind of useless and that it's the humanities that we need to be learning instead. And although I don't necessarily agree with him, I understand where he's coming from. The reason he's saying something like that is because he's thinking questions like, how are you measuring empathy? And how are you measuring that students have a 40% decrease in empathy? I get it, although I don't agree. I still think the social sciences are important. And um, the thing about Final Fantasy as well is that because there's so much reading involved in the game, and it's not even easy reading, a lot of it is in more Old English, and it uses words that you might not be accustomed to using in day to day language, that it sifts through initially the type of people who'd want to get into the game to begin with. People who are inherently people who enjoy reading and who enjoy literature and who enjoy narrative are going into the game. So there's a selection bias in that sense as well. That the people who are playing it are people who are interested in those sorts of experiences. And as I just discussed, people who are interested in those sorts of experiences will tend to have a better developed theory of mind, empathy, all these sorts of things. Now, that's the narrative side of things. The other side of things is the actual game design itself. And Kevin Jordan, who was the guy who worked on WoW, the very original version, Vanilla, him and two other game designers, was talking about how he would play Ultima Online, which is a very old MMO by now. And in Ultima Online, your skills would level up randomly. You'd go throughout the world, and then sometimes something would proc, and then you'd get a level up in a specific skill. And he said that eventually Ultima Online changed, and they made it so that every 15 minutes, the first skill that you used on that 15-minute interval would get +1, would level up +1. And so what they ended up doing at that time was the players would set an egg timer for 15 minutes. And every 15 minutes, they would log on, hit the skill they wanted to level up. They'd get +1 in that skill, log off, wait 15 more minutes, log back in, hit the skill they wanted to level up, ad infinitum. They just do this for until they didn't want to do it anymore. And he said that anytime a game implements this sort of game design, it's the beginning of the end. And the reason he says that is he says that when that happens, you're no longer playing the game. You're just optimizing time for rewards, and it makes a lot of sense. And it's that sort of game design that has kind of overtaken the end game in World of Warcraft. And it has all of these systems, and these systems are time gated, and you have dailies, and then if you don't do your dailies, you fall behind. And it uses and it utilizes this egg timer game design. And so it starts to feel more like homework, and it starts to feel less like fun or play. And this could be frustrating to players, but because they have an investment in the game and they have sunk cost in the game, then they feel like they have to keep playing it. And this could create agitation, and they could project their frustration onto others. So that's another reason. Now, when it comes to the game design, of course, you have the Sprout system in Final Fantasy XIV as well. And if you don't know what that is, if you're new to Final Fantasy XIV, during the first several hours playing the game, there's an icon on top of your head of like a little sprout, and it's an indicator to people that you are new to the game, you might not know everything, and when that's implemented into the game, people will tend to understand like, okay, this is a new player, let's help them out. But World of Warcraft doesn't have that system. Why? I don't fucking know. I think it's a great idea, but they don't. And the third thing that kind of comes to mind for me when we're talking about the differences in the game design between these two games is World of Warcraft is a game that has become very heavily reliant on add-ons. And to play the game competitively and to, kind of progress in that game, you need to download all of these third-party extensions. And that's including things like Deadly Boss mods, which tells you when you're stepping to something you're not supposed to. But the real issue, I think, is the DPS meters. And DPS stands for damage per second. And when you're playing World of Warcraft and you're in a group, there will be a chart that shows how much damage you're doing and how much damage you're doing compared to everybody else. And a lot of classes, a lot of the DPS classes want to maximize their damage per second. And this creates a situation where players then have to calculate whether or not to step out of a mechanic or step out of some dangerous skill or spell that a boss would use in order to cast their skill, do their damage. And the problem is, if they move out of the mechanic, they're sacrificing DPS because they're spending time moving instead of doing damage. and they want to impress people. They want to impress their group. So sometimes they'll stay in the mechanic just so they can do more damage, but that would result in them dying. And then that would result in them wiping. That would result in frustration. Whereas in Final Fantasy, that's not allowed. And when you don't have damage meters and you're not, comparing yourself in that way, you're not thinking, oh, maybe I can just suck it up and take this damage so then I could output more damage so I could look better. You're not thinking like that. You're just thinking about how you can get through the raid or the dungeon in Final Fantasy 14 so that you could all, as a collective, win. And you're not thinking about competing against your teammates and doing better on the charts than your teammates because that's just not allowed in the game. And I think it's all of these factors when they come together that create an environment that will lead to these outcomes where Final Fantasy's community tends to be more welcoming, they tend to be less toxic. And I'm not saying it's a perfect community, I'm sure that human beings are human beings no matter where you are. And I'm still in ARR, which is A Realm Reborn, which is the base expansion of the game. Been having a lot of fun. And these are just things I've kind of noticed in my time playing compared to World of Warcraft in recent years. And that's all I had to say for this video. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.